Today's talk is on a sutta called the Yasa Sutta. The question, and it's a recurring question, regarding the difficulties of staying disentangled from the world while we have to be in the world. Those of us that aren't practicing in monasteries, which is most of us, have to interact with the world, and it's almost impossible to not get entangled with the world. So the question has come up in a few different ways. How and why do we do this? And this sutta, the Yasa Sutta, is a sutta that touches on a few different themes. One is the importance of being part of a well-focused sangha. Just because a group might call itself a Buddhist group doesn't necessarily mean that it practices what the Buddha taught. And so this was a problem even during the Buddhist time. And then usually a group that is not well focused on the Buddhist Dhamma will form around social conventions and the need for social distraction rather than a well-focused sangha. So again, the importance of having that and having a realistic view of your teacher as someone who can actually teach the Dhamma rather than someone who might have a certain amount of fame. And again, the Buddha addresses this. The Buddha was teaching in Inca Nagala. The locals all knew of the Buddha as a rightly self-awakened human being who was unexcelled as a teacher and whose teachings are entirely useful and practical. They were a close-knit group who depended on their group for direction and guidance, meaning it was the group's desire, what they wanted to learn, what they wanted to study, what they were enamored with, that became their so-called Dhamma practice, rather than actually practicing something that an awakened human being actually taught. They prepared a feast with many delicacies for the Buddha and his Sangha, and they approached the Buddha's dwelling and began making a noisy racket so they would be noticed. The Venerable Nagita was attending the Buddha, and then the Buddha asked Nagita what all that noise was about. Nagita responded, "Great teacher, those are the locals who have brought you many delicacies to honor you and the Sangha." The Buddha said, "Nagita, I do not seek honor or recognition. Whoever cannot obtain through their own understanding and with ease, as I do, the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening, let them consent to this common pleasure, this dulling pleasure, this pleasure born of gain and of receiving offerings and fame." So again, rather than make a social event out of him teaching the Dhamma, he's refusing all of that and asking them to put aside those things that are a distraction, and to come together only as a Sangha. It's such an important point, and it's an important example for anybody who's teaching the Dhamma, to not make it a social event, to make it something that is well focused, and then you can get into other social activities outside of the actual Dhamma practice. The Buddha has recognized that the locals have created a group identity through their association that overemphasized their association, rather their group was more important than the Dhamma. And it created a type of worship of the Buddha. And that this often happens because when we are dismissing all or part of the Buddha's Dhamma, there needs to be a substitution for something. And usually that is some form of subtle or not so subtle worship, or different rites and rituals that we develop because we don't have anything else to practice. Nagita asks again, "Great teacher, please relent. The locals will follow you because of their virtue and understanding." The Buddha responds, again, "Nagita, I do not seek honor or recognition. Whoever cannot obtain through their own understanding and with ease, as I do, the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening, let them consent to this common and dulling pleasure, this pleasure born of gain and of receiving offerings and fame. There are many who are unable to develop the understanding with ease that leads to the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening. When people all live together and assemble together and live committed to dwelling with a group, they are unable to develop understanding with ease, which is why they live together and they assemble together and live committed to dwelling with a group. In other words, again, the group itself and the association with the group has become more important and more significant, giving into groupthink rather than the radical and straightforward thinking that a Buddha taught. Nagita, when I see a community delighting in their interactions, laughing loudly, grabbing at one another, I know that they will not be able to develop the pleasure of renunciation and the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, and the pleasure of self-awakening, which is why, it's Buddha's words, which is precisely why they are delighting in their interactions and laughing loudly and grabbing at one another. Again, the social interaction, the social aspects of the group have taken precedence over actually developing the Dhamma. Then there are those communities, Nagita, who revel in food, eating as much as they want, who take pleasure in sensory contact, pleasure in lying down, pleasure in dullness. I know that they will not be able to develop the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, and the pleasure of self-awakening. Having eaten as much as they want, taking pleasure from sensory contact, and from lying down in dullness. Sounds like he's describing the after effects of a pretty good party. Then there are those who attempt to develop concentration in a community where disturbance is likely. This, I know, is not conducive to developing the Dhamma. Again, practicing anything but the Buddhist Eightfold Path. But those that have found the root of a tree or an empty hut, this is how the Buddha describes meditating. Go find the root of a tree or an empty hut. Well secluded, even though they may be drowsy, they will dispel their drowsiness and be mindful of their seclusion, pointing to the importance of having seclusion as the regular theme of our meditation practice, meaning that it's something that we do on a regular basis and not just with a group. And so that points to those that come to my classes even and only meditate there. It's so important to develop a meditation practice on your own, a practice that is rooted in seclusion. The Buddha continues, then there are those that have established seclusion but are not yet well concentrated. Meditating in seclusion, they will quickly develop concentration and will protect their concentration. They will end their distracted mind and be mindful of their seclusion. And of course, in order to appreciate our seclusion, we must be mindful of it. It must be a conscious act that we take and establish that meditation space. The Buddha continues, then there are those that have established seclusion and are well concentrated. They will develop clinging release, which is how the Buddha described an awakened human being. They've developed a profound understanding of suffering, and they've let go of all views rooted in ignorance. They will develop clinging release. They have found the benefit from seclusion. Then there are those that cling to a group and takes food, clothing, shelter, and recognition from the group and becomes enamored with the group. They do not establish seclusion and will not end distraction. Again, the importance of Dhamma practice rather than simply engaging in a social activity that might loosely call itself Buddhist practice. Nagita, then there are those well established in seclusion who receive food, clothes, shelter, and recognition from the group, knowing the benefit of seclusion and knowing the benefit of restraint with no disturbance will arise in them. So again, the Buddha concludes this sutta with placing the importance back on developing a practice that is the meditation practice I'm talking about, that is primarily rooted in seclusion, and then being part of, and for many people this takes quite a bit of searching, being part of a well-focused Sangha, a Sangha that is focused only on the Buddha's teaching, and doesn't create a social atmosphere around getting together as a Sangha to practice the Dhamma. In other words, we don't make light meal or tea or coffee or anything else around that often then gives in to idle chatter. Simply, that's what human beings do when they get together, which in a very subtle but very powerful way directly takes away from the Dhamma. So again, the Buddha is teaching the group that is there to gather together as a Sangha, well focused on the Buddha's Dhamma, to avoid the introduction of entertainment, meaning, any other teachers or readings or recordings or rites and rituals that have nothing to do with what the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught a simple and well-focused and straightforward Dhamma that anybody who takes to it wholeheartedly can awaken. As long as we avoid the common distractions in life and avoid the need to bring those distractions or even practices of worship into those practices, into our Dhamma practice, to keep it pure, keep it simple. And the best way to do that is just keep it, maintain the framework of the Eightfold Path as a framework for our Dhamma practice. So that's my talk for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you find benefit from it, please consider a donation at becoming-buddha.com. And I look forward to speaking with you next week. Peace.